The Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942 through February 1943. The bloodiest battle of World War II. By early 1942, despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to defeat the Soviet Union in a swift campaign, the Wehrmacht had seized a large chunk of Soviet territory. Because of this, Hitler was confident that they could deal a decisive blow to the Red Army, even after suffering heavy German losses near Moscow the previous winter. Planning this new campaign, the Germans decided to focus on the southern parts of the Soviet Union. The initial objectives became to direct their attacks around Stalingrad to destroy the industrial capacity of the city. This would also cut off central Russia from that region. However, in July, Hitler personally rewrote the plans to place a greater emphasis on the capture of Stalingrad itself. Both the Germans and the Soviets had placed a heavy value on the city, which of course bore the name of the Soviet leader. Hitler proclaimed that after Stalingrad's capture, its male citizens were to be killed, and all women and children were to be deported. It was also assumed by both sides that the capture of the city would significantly change the Eastern Front in the favor of Nazi Germany. The Soviets realized their desperate situation and ordered everyone who could hold a rifle into the fight. The order of battle. As for the Germans, we are met with Colonel General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army, composed of the 4th, 8th, and 11th Army Corps, along with the 14th Panzer Corps, and with the support of the Luftwaffe. This initial total was 270,000 personnel, 3,000 artillery pieces, 500 tanks, and 600 aircraft. The Soviets are equipped with infamous Army General Georgy Zhukov and his composition of the 28th, 51st, 57th, 62nd, and 64th Armies, supported by the 8th Air Army. The initial strength totaled 187,000 personnel, 2,200 artillery pieces, 400 tanks, and 300 aircraft. These numbers would quadruple on both sides by the end of the battle, also seeing involvement from the militaries of Italy, Romania, Croatia, and Hungary, along with a large swath of the Russian civilian population. The Soviets had enough of a warning to ship grain, cattle, and railway cars across the Volga River and out of the grasp of the Germans before the initial attack. Despite this, Stalin refused to evacuate the 400,000 civilians within Stalingrad, calling it a harvest victory. The city was short on food before the Germans had even arrived. On August 23rd, the German 6th Army reached Stalingrad in a chase for the fleeing 62nd and 64th Armies. The battle started when the Luftwaffe began to heavily bomb the city. By this time, it was the largest air formation in the world. More than 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped within the first 48 hours. It is not known how many civilians were killed in these bombings, but the estimates are high. Most of the city was quickly turned to rubble. The factories that withstood the bombings continued their production. Stalin began to rush troops across the Volga. These river ferries and troop barges quickly became easy targets for the Luftwaffe. Rumors have surfaced that Stalin had prevented civilians from leaving the city, in the belief that their presence would encourage greater resistance from Stalingrad's defenders. In the initial stages of the battle, the Soviet Air Force was decimated by the Luftwaffe. The reports within the first week of battle stated that the Soviets had lost over 200 of their 300 aircraft. By all accounts, the Luftwaffe had complete domination over the skies. The overwhelming burden of the city's initial defense fell to the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, which was a unit mainly made up of young female volunteers with little to no training. Despite this, the AA gunners stayed at their defenses and took on the advancing panzers with great success, until they were surrounded and crushed. Over and over, civilians were sent into battle without weapons or rifles. In one situation, the staff and students of a local technical university assembled a rough tank unit composed of leftover parts from a tractor factory. These tanks, which were unpainted and lacking gun sights, were driven right off the factory floor into the front. By the end of August, the Germans had reached the Volga on the north side of Stalingrad. Because of this, the Soviets could only reinforce and supply their troops by making perilous crossings across the Volga while being shelled by artillery and aircraft. On September 5th, the Soviet 24th and 66th Armies attempted to organize a mass counterattack, but was heavily repelled by the Luftwaffe. This same scenario was repeated time and time again. Stalin's Order Number 227, which was put into place in July of 1942, took a massive toll on the Soviet military, especially in Stalingrad. This order meant that all deserters and any presumed malingerers were to be arrested or executed. Alone, the 62nd Army had 139 arrests and 49 executions. The battle began to stall as fighting became ever more fierce and desperate within the city. Fighting between buildings, streets, rooms, and hallways made the battle even more deadly and caused territory gains to slow to a halt. A key tactical weapon of war on both sides was the deployment of snipers. Using ruined buildings as hidden cover, they were able to inflict devastating casualties. Snipers usually targeted soldiers bringing up food or water, artillery spotters, and officers. Some Soviet commanders adapted and adopted new tactics of always keeping their front line as close to the Germans as they were physically capable of doing. It was called hugging the Germans. The Red Army itself gradually gave into a new strategy to hold on to a position as long as possible. They began to convert apartments, factories, warehouses, residences, and offices to a series of well-defended strongpoints with small squads to occupy them. After 3 months of a desperate advance, the Germans' full front line finally reached the Volga's riverbanks. However, the Soviets had discovered a weakness in the Germans' flanks. They planned to prey on this weakness in an offensive named Operation Uranus. The goal was to punch through the overstretched and weakly defended German flanks and surround the main German forces in the city. On November 19th, the Red Army launched the operation. The Romanians on the northern flank caught wind of the preparations and requested reinforcements, only to be denied. Thinly spread, deployed in tactically weak positions, outnumbered, and poorly equipped, the Romanian Third Army was quickly overrun. Fortunately for the Soviets, poor weather prevented any effective air assaults by the Luftwaffe during the offensive. The following day, another Soviet offensive was launched in the south, to more success. The success of both of these operations resulted in the surrounding of the Axis forces in Stalingrad. The surrounded personnel were composed of 265,000 Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Croatians. Knowing the importance of the Sixth Army to the Germans, the Soviets immediately set up 2 defensive lines, one facing inward to Stalingrad and another facing outward. The Germans made many attempts to break out the encircled Sixth Army. One such attempt was to air supply the Sixth until a counteroffensive could be organized. However, even though such air supply chains were formed, they could only manage to deliver 85 tons of supplies per day, over 400 less of what was needed. Thus, fuel and ammunition were prioritized in the hope that encircled Germans could hold out for longer. This meant that the Sixth Army slowly starved to death. The Germans developed a plan to break through to the Sixth Army and establish a supply corridor, codenamed Operation Winter Storm. Upon the launch of the offensive, its initial result was successful. However, the Sixth Army, who was starving and being constantly pressured by the surrounding Soviets, did not make any attempt to link up with the relief force. While the Winter Storm offensive raged on, the Soviets concocted a new offensive, an offensive to counter the counter-offensive. This new operation was codenamed Little Saturn. While this offensive wasn't necessarily effective, it definitely shifted the German command's attention off of relieving the Sixth Army to dealing with the new Soviet push. Over the next couple of months, the Soviets offered surrender to the surrounded Sixth Army on multiple different occasions and were met with resistance each time. On one occasion, Colonel General Paulus asked for permission to accept the surrender terms. He told Hitler that he was incapable of further defense, considering his troops were out of ammunition and food. Hitler rejected his request, stating for him to stand to the last soldier and last bullet. In late January, pushes from the Soviets forced the Sixth Army to be split into two pockets, the North and South, and then into three parts, North, Center, and South. A couple of days later, Paulus informed Hitler that his men would likely collapse before the end of the day. In response to this, in desperation, Hitler issued a list of field promotions to the Sixth Army officers. Most notably, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal General. In doing this, Hitler noted that there was no record of any German or Prussian field marshals to have ever surrendered. The implication was clear. If Paulus surrendered, he would shame more than just himself. Hitler's hope was that Paulus would either fight to the very last man or commit suicide. On the next day, the southern and central pocket collapsed to the Soviets. It was only 2 days later that the northern pocket fell to the Soviets as well, and the Battle of Stalingrad was concluded. Around 91,000 exhausted, ill, wounded, and starving prisoners were taken by the Soviets. Among them were 22 generals. Hitler was furious that Paulus could have, quote, freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow, end quote. Meaning, why didn't he take the easy way out? In total, casualties from the Battle of Stalingrad are estimated around 2 million, with roughly 800,000 from the Axis and 1.1 million from the Soviets.